In January, I asked people if they wanted to share any children's folklore as part of this month's theme. As a branch of study, children's folklore largely refers to folklore created, shared and maintained by children. Adults are not involved in its generation. So contributors could share folklore they remembered from their childhood, or they could share what they'd heard from children in their lives now. Most responses came from those sharing memories of childhood folklore and fell broadly into three categories. This is the second of 3 podcast episodes about them. We've already covered urban legends last week, and next week we're going to have a look at games and practices. But this week we're going to have a look at the beliefs that children shared. So let's go and have a look at beliefs about supernatural beings like witches, and also how people use plants or use superstitions in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This is actually my third attempt at recording this episode today because all there seems to have been all day is workmen outside running generators and making all manner of noise, so hopefully I won't be interrupted while I'm trying again. Like I said in the introduction, we are on to the second of 3 episodes about children's folklore based on the survey responses that you gave me, and as I say, they are delightful to read. I've really been enjoying looking at what people have been posting, and it's been lovely to see how completely different some of the beliefs are, but also how similar they are in other places as well. So I hope that you're enjoying these as well. And we're just going to jump straight in because I don't really need much preamble. But the first set of beliefs that I had were around the good folk, which you can also refer to as fairies, but obviously the good folk is a nicer euphemism for them. But I was pleased to see them and their brethren show up in a couple of the reported beliefs. So Hazel from Boggart Hole Clough in Manchester reported a pair of beliefs from the 1970s. In one, Hazel said, and I quote, "There is a boggart living here. Everyone knows that, but my brother told me that he saw it, and I think I might have seen him too, though just the eyes watching me," end quote. Because that's not a scary mental image at all, is it? As far as the other belief from Hazel went, she said, and I quote, "I was also told, I think by my mum, I can't actually remember ever being told it, it's just something I always knew, that sprouts were cabbages grown by the fairies and you should always leave one on your plate at the end of your meal for them to have," end quote. I can't stand sprouts, so the good folk are more than welcome to mine, but I thought that was actually quite a sweet little belief related to the good neighbours. And speaking of sweet beliefs and the good neighbours, Neil reported a belief from Ashington in Northumberland in the early 1980s that he and other kids, and I quote, called the rainbow spots of petrol that we'd see on wet tarmac in the back streets fairy rings, end quote. And I thought that one was absolutely charming. And yeah, you do get that weird circular pattern of petrol or oil or anything like that on wet surfaces. So I think the idea of them being fairy rings is quite lovely. Our next supernatural being is the witch. And Teresa from central Minnesota shared a story which isn't really children's folklore because it came from her as an adult rather than her children. But I did want to include it purely because it demonstrates a key factor within a lot of folklore, and that is the figure of the witch as a cautionary tale. So as Teresa explains, and I quote, "We owned a property adjacent to a massive wetland and duck pond. When our children were very young, I did everything I could to keep them from wandering off into the bog. It worked with my oldest, but my youngest, 3 at the time, had a heightened sense of his survival prowess. So, out of an abundance of frustration, I finally said, 'There's a swamp witch who likes to tempt small children into the swamp and steal them. Once you turn 6, she doesn't want you anymore, but if you're really little and she catches you, she'll keep you.' The moment I heard those words escape my lips, so much folklore suddenly made sense. One of their uncles even started talking to them about how he used to live with the swamp witch, but she kicked him out," end quote. So I thought that was quite interesting how even though it didn't come from the children, the way that folklore can just spontaneously erupt as a form of cautionary tale in order to keep children safe, I think is quite a common thread that we see through quite a lot of folklore. And it did remind me a lot of Jenny Greenteeth, who we obviously have in England, with the idea that she's used to try and keep people away from ponds in particular, but also rivers as well. I was also very pleased to see 2 people reporting the same belief regarding witches and eggshells, and one came from East Anglia and the other one came from Oxfordshire, but it was basically the same belief, so it was really cool to see it come out twice. And Nick from East Anglia reported the belief, and I quote, that when you eat a boiled egg, you must turn it over and punch a hole in the shell with your spoon, or the witches will use it as a boat to float down the river and go and drown the sailors. It's so ingrained, I still do it. Actually, I don't think I'll ever not do it, in fact. Born 1965, end quote. And as Helen from Oxfordshire heard from her grandmother, you should, and I quote, crack your eggshells after you have a boiled egg, or witches will use them to sail out to sea and sink ships, end quote. I'd often run into this being a belief in traditional folklore sources, so it was really nice to hear that people actually shared the belief in reality, and also relatively recently. So it is quite nice when you come across things and you're like, is that actually a belief, or is that just something that someone's collected once? But to then collect it twice was really, really interesting. So that was cool. We do also have a creature, and fellow podcaster and all-round good egg Owen Staten had this to say about the Brenin Lwyd in Wales, and I will let him tell you this part.
When I was a child, and I mean a small child, the kind who still believed that wardrobes might open into other worlds, I was terrified of a Brenin Lwyd. Not in the way that grown men speak of fear, not in the way that we dress it up now with folklore and knowing smiles. No. This was the raw, stomach-tightening, blanket over your head kind of fear. The kind that only a child can feel. You see, we lived in a little bungalow on the edge of the Welsh mountains. To adult eyes it would have seemed ordinary and safe and cosy. But to a child, it sat at the edge of everything, at the edge of the world, at the edge of the unknown. Behind it there were hills. Behind those hills there was just darkness. And in that darkness, oh, my imagination, it built kingdoms. It was my grandfather, who once told me about the Brenin Lwyd, the grey king, the great ape of the Welsh mountains, the Bigfoot of Wales. A towering thing that walked upright through the mist, broad as a dough frame, silent as falling ash. He meant it as a story, a tale to, give the hills character. But children, we don't file stories away as stories. We take them in, we feed them, we let them grow. And once the Brenin Lwyd lived in my imagination, he never left. At night, when the house settled and the pipes clicked, when the wind pressed against the walls, I would lie in my small bed, staring at the window. I was no more than 8, perhaps even younger, young enough that the world still blurred at the edges between real and imagined. In that room, the curtains never closed properly. There was always a sliver of glass exposed to the night. And I was convinced, utterly convinced, in the way only a child can be, that something was out there, watching. And one night, I woke. No dramatic thunder, no crash, just the sudden electric certainty that I was not alone. I remember how small I felt, how huge the room seemed, how far away my parents' bedroom felt, down just a dim hallway. And I turned my head towards the window, and there, filling it, was a shape. To this day, I can't tell you whether it was a shadow, a tree, a trick of moonlight, or simply my own fear made visible. But to that boy, lying frozen beneath his blankets, it was the Brenin Lwyd. Massive, broad-shouldered, its head slightly bowed, as if it was peering in. The glass had misted faintly, and I remember with absolute childhood certainty thinking, "It's breathing." I did not think logically. I did not reason, because children don't reason with fear. I believed with all my heart that if I moved, if I made a sound, it would know. And I lay there, my eyes barely blinking, trying to make myself smaller, trying to disappear into the mattress. The terror was pure, simple, and total. Not the layered fear of adulthood, no mortgages, no responsibility, just a primal dread that something enormous stood inches away, separated from me by nothing more than a small pane of glass and hope. And then slowly the shape shifted, or the clouds moved, or my exhausted mind blinked, and it was gone. And morning came as it always does, and the mountains looked gentle again, and the window innocent. But the fear lingered. And I grew up, of course. I learned about shadows, about how the mind of a child is a powerful, untamed thing, and how stories once planted bloom in the dark. And as a man, a grown man, I can quite calmly say that I never truly saw a mountain ape at my bungalow window. But as a boy, I absolutely did. And sometimes, when I pass that old place in memory, I think about him, that small child in the narrow bed, heart pounding, eyes wide, facing something far too large for him to understand. The Brenin Lwyd was a childhood fear, but it was as real to the child that I was as anything. And perhaps that's where such creatures truly live, not in the mountains, but in the wild, boundless landscape of my imagination.
I hope you enjoyed that little intermission by Owen. You can hear way more from Owen over on his Time Between Times podcast, and obviously he has also provided his storytelling talents on Fabulous Folklore before, so you can check out other episodes that feature him as well. And our final supernatural being, but before we go into the more general beliefs, comes courtesy of my own mother. And I was telling her what I was doing for this particular week's episode, and she sort of went, "Oh, I could tell you one." And then she told us it, and I was like, my God, that absolutely has to go in there, because this is just so weird. And it did kind of make me go, what else hasn't she been telling me? But this is what she said, and I quote, "At the bottom of our street there was a manhole cover, and if you dropped a stone into an opening in the manhole cover, after a certain number of seconds it would land and it would make a noise as if it had hit something tin. So my friend Kenneth and I came up with the idea that it was the tin god, because every time we dropped a stone into this manhole cover, you heard ping as it hit the tin god. We must have been about 8 at the time, so we had no idea what the tin god would have actually done." End quote. It is so amazing the things that you learn about your family members when you tell them that you're collecting folklore. So I'd highly recommend that you give it a go. Tell them what you're looking into, tell them what you're interested in, or just ask them what they remember from their childhood. So you can ask parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, neighbours, anyone that you just happen to have a relatively good rapport with, who you think might actually be able to tell you some interesting stuff. So see what you can find out. And if you come across anything like the tin god, then please do let me know. Obviously, I said we were going to look at other general beliefs, and some of the beliefs that came via grandparents or parents often involved plants or fruit. So Teresa from Italy reported that, and I quote, "My grandfather told me that if you ate watermelon seeds, the fruit would grow in your stomach." End quote. And interestingly, my granddad told my mum the same thing, except it was apple pips rather than watermelon seeds. I'm not really sure what you're supposed to do with the information. And then for an even weirder idea, Helen from Oxfordshire remembered the idea that you'd hold a buttercup under your chin and it shone yellow if you liked butter. And I actually remember doing that as a kid and always being really pleased because it shone yellow, and it's like, well, does it ever not shine yellow? I don't know that I've ever come across anyone that it doesn't reflect yellow on the skin. But there we go. But interestingly, this one appears to be alive and well, because Teresa from Italy also reported that, and I quote, "My son is growing up in England, and he and his friends told me that if small yellow flowers are placed under your chin and the colour reflects on your skin, you like butter," end quote. So I thought that was really cool that it does actually still appear and essentially hasn't actually really changed. Jen from Leeds was told as a child, and I quote, that hogweed was called mother dye and that if you picked it then your mum would die, end quote. You also get a very similar belief about plants like cow parsley, because it does look a lot like poison hemlock. So obviously the prohibition on not picking it is basically to make sure that you don't take something poisonous home, but it then ends up applying to other plants that just look very, very similar instead. Jen was also told, and I quote, that picking dandelions made you wet the bed, end quote, and I've got an entire episode on that with dandelions if you're interested. And then she was also told, and this one is gross, and I quote, that gooseberries, school dinner crumble, were all the animals' eyes from the butchers, end quote. And I read that one and just went, ew, that's nasty. And I just think I can totally see where someone would come from with that. But it just is absolutely gross. So thank you for that one, Jen. We also had a series of beliefs about good and bad luck. So Libby from Leiston in Suffolk reported the belief, and I quote, "It's bad luck to open a crisp packet upside down," end quote, which I hadn't heard that one before, so that one was quite interesting. Meanwhile, Holly from Hertfordshire reported the local belief about, and I quote, "crossing your fingers when walking underneath a sign and not walking on 3 drains as they're both bad luck," end quote. I can sort of understand the not walking under a sign. It feels a little bit like the same territory as not walking under a ladder, but there we go. I received an anonymous response, presumably from the US, that said, and I quote, "If you are going under a bridge and a train is passing over, if you hold on to a button while all this is happening and make a wish, it will come true," end quote. I'd never heard that one before, although there was a general vibe in the response that was quite a common belief, so it obviously hasn't made its way to the UK as far as I'm aware, but if you have heard that one before, again, please do feel free to let me know. Helen in Oxfordshire also reported a range of beliefs about luck, heard from both her grandmother and other children. So these ran along the lines of, and I quote, "If you get dressed with your clothes or a piece of clothing inside out or back to front and you adjust it to the right way, you will have bad luck. If you find a money spider, you should twirl around your head 3 times for good luck. Don't put new shoes on the table, it's bad luck. And black cats brought good luck while white cats brought bad luck," end quote. And I thought this was quite interesting because I'd heard about the one about not changing your clothes around, and I can't help thinking that may come from the idea of people intentionally putting things on inside out or back to front to avoid being pixie-led or to undo the enchantment of being pixie-led, which is basically when the good neighbours decide to lead you astray. I hadn't heard the one about money spiders, and I just feel like twirling a spider around doesn't necessarily feel like the most fun thing you could do ever. Whereas the one about shoes on the table, I've actually heard that from quite a lot of mining communities, and it's usually referring to any shoes on the table, whether they're new or not, with the idea being that the shoes are being put on the table because somebody hadn't survived a disaster in the pit. So I can sort of see where that's coming from. But it was really nice to see the one about the cats, because in a lot of places it's black cats that are bad luck and white cats that are good luck. So it was quite nice to see that reversed for a change, because I'm quite a fan of black cats. But this naturally leads into a sense of superstitions as well, and I got a wonderful belief from an anonymous listener who reported the belief, and I quote, "When you lie, a red stripe appears on your forehead," end quote. And as they continued, they said, and I quote, "We used to hide the stripe with our hands," which obviously gave away the lie. "To this day, any child under 8 still believes the line exists and only older people can see it," end quote, which I thought was a really interesting one. And then there was a series of superstitions from Helen from Oxfordshire via her gran or other children, which ran, and I quote, "Don't walk under ladders, something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue for a bride. The tooth fairy will come and take your tooth to build fairy palaces and leave you a 6pence. If you walk 3 times anti-clockwise round the church, you'll disappear. If you swallow bubble gum or chewing gum, it will stick your insides up. Don't open an umbrella indoors. The magpie rhymes, so 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, etc. Spill salt and you have to throw a bit of it over your shoulder to hit the devil in the eye," end quote. I'd heard almost all of these apart from the one about the tooth fairy, because we weren't told you'd get a sixpence, it was just a coin. And I remember being fascinated that I used to obviously get English money when I was at home because I was in England. But then when I went on holiday, I did actually get some Spanish pesetas because it was well before the euro at that point. And I didn't know that they were taking your tooth to build a fairy palace. We never found out what they were taking your teeth for, and I don't remember ever actually asking. But that's sort of makes sense that they'd be using them as building materials. And I've now got a really weird mental image of like teeth-based dry stone walls. I don't know if that's kind of where I should be going with that one. But I hadn't heard the one about the disappearing if you go 3 times anti-clockwise round the church, because I have heard similar ideas with things like if you run around a church anti-clockwise, something will appear. Sometimes the devil might even be a vision of your future partner, but I hadn't really seen that many where you would disappear as a result of running around the church. And if anyone's interested about the magpie rhyme, there is an entire podcast episode just about that. And speaking of the idea of conjuring visions of your future partner, I think all long-time listeners will know that I've got a genuine fascination with love divination, which is why I wrote a book about it, which is my new book, Bring Me Love. But it was nice to see some of these pop up even among the childhood beliefs as well. So Helen from Oxfordshire remembered some of the classic love divinations involving fruit and plants. The first one was the idea that, and I quote, if you peel an apple in one long piece and throw it over your shoulder, the shape of it will be the shape of the letter of the one you will marry, end quote. And alternatively, you could also, and I quote, turn an apple stem around in the apple and go through the letters of the alphabet for each turn. This again will give you the letter of your loved one, end quote. I have tried that one multiple times and I never really get past F or G. So I do apologise to the people at the other end of the alphabet for that one. There was also the classic practice of plucking daisy petals with the idea of he loves me not. So it was nice to see that that one made an appearance as well. For our penultimate set of beliefs, this one revolves entirely around pavement cracks, which seems like a weird thing to focus on, but you might have heard this rhyme, you might not, and it went, step on a crack, you'll break your father's back, step on a line, you'll break your mother's spine. And that was the version I remember from late 1980s, early 1990s Newcastle. And Jen from Leeds and Helen from Oxfordshire both also remembered this particular idea of not stepping on pavement cracks, but for them it was to avoid bad luck if you stepped on the cracks. But Georgia reported a variation on the belief from Torquay, Devon, which completely took that idea and then built an entire new thing on top of it, which is brilliant. And Georgia said, and I quote, in the 80s we weren't supposed to step on the cracks in pavements because it was bad luck. My cousin once told me I'd explode if I did. This included cracks from damage as well as the edges of paving slabs, which often made walking some places interesting. This seemed fairly typical law for children at the time, but in our school it extended to the painted lines on our playground. The younger classes were only allowed to play on one side of a specific yellow line. This became a sacred line we couldn't touch. Even when we were told to come in, we'd all have to jump over that line to get past it. If you accidentally stepped on it, everyone would gasp and scream. But to my knowledge, nobody exploded, end quote. And I love that. It just seems like that typical thing where you've got this belief that's quite common, but then one set of people just takes it and runs with it. And I thought that was really imaginative. I'm glad to hear nobody exploded. That's obviously a good thing. But it was quite interesting that, as I say, it just extended the law a little bit further. And we're on to our final piece of law, and I had to give the last word to Sarah from Seattle, who was told this by her 6-year-old son. And the reason I wanted to keep it to last, 1, it's wildly imaginative, and 2, it's still ongoing. So this was really cool. So I'll be dying to know if anybody else has come across this, but I doubt it because it seems very, very specific. But anyway, as Sarah says, and I quote, a fictional place called Queequeg Town has a stranglehold on my son's first grade class. It was the invention of one child who is obsessed with raccoons. Queequeg Town is populated by raccoons. Its lore is extensive, and once the rest of the class got a hold of it, it has been expanded by other children to include additional places like Cat Town and Bunny Town, both self-explanatory, and Green Abundance. I have no idea. They speak a different language in Queequeg Town, so it's spelt quick but it's pronounced queek, which the children speak in tongues to each other. It sounds a little like German. Queequeg Town might be an empire. I believe it's located in Africa and it's ruled by a king raccoon. Every new thing the kids learn gets folded into being actually about or from Queequeg Town. I was startled the other day to hear them talking about the Holy Cretan Empire, and it only made sense when I realised that my kid had heard about the Holy Roman Empire for the first time the day before, end quote. And I thought that was absolutely phenomenal that this one kid's obsession with raccoons has just led to this absolutely amazing sort of world building exercise, essentially. But it's not just world building, it's shared world building. And I'd love to know what green abundance is supposed to refer to, so I thought that one was brilliant. But it's such a really cool way for them to fold what they're learning into this body of shared knowledge, which is really quite interesting, and almost like collaborative learning, which is quite cool. But I don't know, there was just something about it that really, really caught my attention, and I think it really speaks to that imagination and inventiveness and creativity that kids have that I kind of wish that people would hang on to as they get older. So I just thought, yeah, never mind your artificial intelligence and whatnot, just mention one thing to a 6-year-old and see what happens. So I sort of felt like that was such a brilliant, brilliant piece of shared folklore. And because it's happening now, that just made it even better. So if Sarah's got any updates on what else has been added to the whole empire, then by all means feel free to add into that. I did love that so much it had to basically end the episode. So what do we make of these childhood beliefs? As I said last week, I did get 36 responses to my original survey, which for my purposes was excellent and more than enough. But it does also mean that you can't necessarily draw any specific conclusions because you really need to have a few more to do that. But it was interesting how those 36 responses, and obviously some respondents gave more than one piece of information. So obviously I did end up with more than 36. It was just there were 36 respondents. But I think even though they fell into the 3 broad categories, I think the absolute range of the beliefs really astonished me. So I was kind of expecting to see the likes of the good folk and witches turn up, which just shows that some figures never go out of fashion. And on top of that, some of these beliefs, especially around like plants or eggshells and love divination, they're really well attested in traditional folklore sources. So it was quite nice to see them continuing on into the current day. And it did seem quite reassuring that such beliefs that still existed into the 1980s and 1990s to be passed on to listeners. But I think at the same time it was so interesting to see the invention of the law about the swamp witch only wanting kids up to 6 and then losing interest in them at the point when they'd potentially be safer in the area. But also the creativity and imagination that feeds the shared world of Quickie Town also shows that children don't actually always need to hear folklore to create their own. They can just spontaneously generate it. And I think in some ways that really did make me think that humans do have a natural propensity towards the magical and towards enchanted explanations for things. And you do hear people talking about, like, what is the point of folklore? And I think maybe that's it. Maybe it's a shared experience that we all end up interacting with at some point. And looking at these children's beliefs shows how far back in our lives we actually start that. I don't know. Obviously, my goal for this episode was largely to collect and preserve these children's beliefs rather than analyse them. So if you do remember any or you'd like to add your own, then you can always leave a comment either on the blog post that this episode is for, and the link is in the show notes. You can leave comments on YouTube and Spotify, and if there's any of the other platforms you want to use, obviously I'm on most of the social media ones, so feel free to leave things there. I don't have any blather at the end like I normally do, other than obviously there are bonus episodes available on Patreon and Substack if you'd like to financially support the show, which obviously does help me to keep things going. But then I also have our final children's law episode coming next week, which will be on games and practices. We also have an episode of Fabulous Folklore Presents, because I got to talk to the absolutely wonderful Najar Lightfoot, who is quite honestly one of the nicest people you'll ever talk to, and we chatted about dolls. So there's a dolls episode coming as well, so hopefully you'll enjoy that. Have a fantastic week ahead, and I'll see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. I don't get paid per play of the podcast like musicians do, so if you'd like to support the podcast so I can keep it ad-free and help me pay for all the annoying stuff like web hosting and cover the hours it takes me to make these episodes, then you can buy me a coffee on Ko-fi or become a member of the Fabulous Folklore family by becoming a paid supporter on Ko-fi, Patreon and Substack. Or you can leave a review, tell a friend, or share episodes on social media for free. It all helps.